I raised him for 30 years, gave up my last meal, sold my wedding ring to send him to college, and then after I had a stroke, I heard him say on the phone, "She's useless now. Sell the house. If you think this is just another ordinary family story, you're dead wrong." Hit subscribe now to catch more of our shocking true film episodes. Under the mellow hue of a late spring morning, Evelyn Carter moved slowly through her garden. Her feet brushed against the dew-laced stone path as she passed rows of blooming azaleas and lavender stalks waving gently in the breeze. The sun was still low, soft, and forgiving, casting golden spears of light through the trees that shaded the back lawn. The garden, her sanctuary, smelled of old earth rosemary and something faintly floral that reminded her of her youth. She moved like someone recently reacquainted with her body, tentative but determined. The cane in her left hand tapped rhythmically against the stone, while her right brushed across a cluster of pale yellow roses. "I almost forgot how quiet mornings can be," she whispered to herself, a wry smile tugging at the corners of her mouth. It had been 3 months since the stroke. A mild one, the doctors said, but it shook her nonetheless. The numbness in her left hand had mostly faded, but something deeper inside her had shifted an awareness of fragility she had spent her whole life ignoring. Her days used to be full volunteering at the library, teaching children how to use the card catalog, organizing community book drives, but since the stroke she'd slowed. She was learning, perhaps for the first time, how to sit still. From the bench beneath the cherry tree, Evelyn looked out across the yard to the back of the house, where ivy crept along the brick, trying its best to reclaim what man had built. The old swing still hung from the walnut tree, and for a flicker of a moment she could almost see her son Jonah at 5 years old, pumping his legs wildly as he soared toward the clouds, laughing. That laugh, carefree and loud, was one of the few things that never faded, even now, 26 years after the accident. Her hand closed around a locket that hung from her neck. Inside it, a picture of Jonah, just before his high school graduation, grinning rebellious, alive. Evelyn breathed in through her nose, holding that breath in the hollow of her chest before releasing it. "I thought you'd outlive me," she said quietly, the words barely louder than the wind. "But life doesn't bargain." When Jonah passed, Evelyn poured every ounce of her grief into the one remaining thread of him, Melissa, her only grandchild. Melissa had been 10 when the accident happened. Evelyn still remembered how small she looked at the funeral, curled into the folds of Evelyn's black skirt, trembling mute. From that day forward, Evelyn made herself a promise to protect her, to love her more than life itself, to never let Melissa feel alone. And she didn't. Evelyn put Melissa through school, bought her a car when she turned 16, co-signed the lease on her first apartment, and finally, when Evelyn's health began to decline, invited her to move in permanently. It had made sense then. Melissa was family, trustworthy, intelligent, good with numbers, a practical girl. That's why Evelyn had made the decision a week ago. She stood slowly brushing bits of bark off her skirt and made her way back into the house through the back porch. The air inside was cooler, tinged with the scent of lemon oil and old wood. Her home hadn't changed in decades, the same pine shelves, the same photographs lining the walls, a life frozen in frames. She walked down the hall, passing the grandfather clock that had belonged to her father, and stopped at the study door. She opened it with a slight push. Inside the room was orderly, minimal. Her father had always kept it that way, and she'd preserved it as a kind of shrine, books aligned perfectly on the shelves, a worn armchair in the corner, and most importantly, a tall wooden cabinet built into the wall. She approached it now, pulling a small brass key from the locket around her neck. The safe opened with a soft mechanical click, and inside were papers, carefully arranged folders, deeds, insurance policies, power of attorney forms, and the Carter House title. Evelyn took them out one by one, placing them meticulously on the desk, like a ritual she had rehearsed in her mind for weeks. Behind her the clock chimed 10 times. She turned her head at the knock on the door. "Come in," she called softly. Melissa stepped inside her heels, clicking across the hardwood floor. She was dressed in one of those smart beige suits Evelyn had helped her buy for job interviews, hair tied back in a loose bun, makeup minimal. Her face was always difficult to read, smooth, symmetrical, but unreadable. Like a page that looked familiar but held no words. "Grandma," she said, glancing at the desk. "Are those?" Evelyn nodded. "They are." Melissa stepped forward, her eyes flicking over the documents with a spark of curiosity. "You're ready to finalize it?" "I am." Evelyn turned, gesturing for her to sit. "You've taken such good care of things, Melissa. The bills, the doctor visits, managing the property taxes. I couldn't have done it without you." Melissa sat slowly, her expression unreadable. "It's nothing, really. I'm just happy to help." "I know," Evelyn said softly, her voice almost reverent. "That's why I'm putting everything in your name, at least temporarily. You'll have power of attorney. If anything happens, I know you'll do the right thing." Melissa blinked, her lips parting slightly. "You're sure?" "I'm sure," Evelyn replied, her eyes steady. "It's time." There was a silence between them, the kind that stretches not awkwardly, but like the tightening of a bow before the release of an arrow. Melissa reached for the document slowly, her fingers grazing the edge of the house title. "I can take these down to the notary this afternoon," she offered. "Get the signatures certified." Evelyn nodded. "There's no rush. Let's review them together first." Melissa leaned in and Evelyn watched her face. She wanted to believe desperately that this was the right decision, that family meant what it used to, that love was still a bond that couldn't be undone by greed, by time, or by convenience. But something deep in her bones shifted. A twitch of hesitation she couldn't name, a breeze across the back of her neck. Still she pressed forward. "I trust you," Evelyn said quietly. Melissa looked up at her and smiled. "Thank you." Evelyn forced herself to smile back. They reviewed each document, Evelyn pointing out the clauses and transfer notes in careful librarian-like detail. She still wore her reading glasses on a silver chain, and her handwriting, elegant cursive, graced every margin with annotations. Melissa listened, nodded, and made tidy notes on a yellow legal pad. When they finished, Evelyn placed the papers back into a manila envelope and sealed it. "You'll file these tomorrow?" she asked. Melissa nodded again. "Of course." "Good," Evelyn said. "I'll leave them in the safe tonight. You can take them in the morning." She opened the safe again, replacing the envelope, and with a soft click locked it. Melissa stood. "I'll make us some tea." Evelyn smiled again, gentler this time. "That would be nice." She turned back to the safe, her fingers lingering on the brass handle. Outside, the sun had shifted past the highest point of the day. Light filtered in through the blinds, striping the floor with warmth. Somewhere in the yard a mockingbird sang. Evelyn stood quietly for a long moment, her back to the door, her hand still on the safe. She closed her eyes. In that moment everything was still, and the storm had not yet begun. The house was quiet that night, wrapped in a strange, uneasy stillness that didn't sit right on Evelyn's chest. The kind of silence that hummed with invisible tension. She had gone to bed early as usual, tucked beneath the heavy quilt that smelled faintly of cedar and lavender. The wind outside whispered through the branches of the walnut tree, brushing its long fingers across the window pane. But sleep didn't come. Her legs ached faintly, the lingering stiffness from the stroke refusing to let her rest. Worse than the discomfort was the heaviness in her thoughts, something she couldn't quite name. A restlessness that had nothing to do with her aging body. She shifted under the blanket, stared at the ceiling, listened to the grandfather clock ticking outside her bedroom door. Tick, tick, tick. Each sound a needle in her mind. After an hour of tossing, she gave up. Evelyn sat up slowly, wincing as her joints protested. She slid her feet into the old woolen slippers beside the bed and wrapped her shawl around her shoulders. The night air crept in through the window cracks, brushing against her skin like a whisper. Still she moved forward, drawn by a need she couldn't articulate. "Just a glass of water," she told herself. "Maybe some tea." She padded quietly down the hallway, her hand brushing the faded floral wallpaper. Every few steps the floorboards let out a faint groan. She passed the study, the living room, entered the kitchen, and stood in the dark for a moment, letting her eyes adjust. The moonlight streamed in through the small kitchen window, illuminating the countertops in a faint blue glow. She opened the cupboard, pulled out a glass, and turned on the faucet. The water splashed softly into the glass, filling the silence. Then footsteps, light quick, passing overhead. Evelyn froze. Melissa's room. She tilted her head. It was past midnight. And then she saw it, a faint golden glow seeping out from beneath Melissa's bedroom door at the top of the stairs. Strange. Melissa always turned in early, earlier than Evelyn even. Said she needed her beauty sleep. Evelyn took a cautious sip of water and waited. The footsteps stopped. A murmur began, low, rhythmic. At first Evelyn thought it was the television, but then the words sharpened into sentences. A conversation. No, a phone call. She crept toward the stairs. Her knees protested the climb, but curiosity, or something deeper, something colder, pushed her upward. She reached the landing and stood just outside Melissa's door, her back pressed to the wall. She could hear her now. Melissa's voice was low and smooth, confident in a way Evelyn rarely heard. No, she doesn't suspect anything. She's still talking like I'm her little angel. It's honestly pathetic. Silence. Evelyn's grip on the water glass tightened. Yeah, the papers are ready. She gave me power of attorney last week. All I need is the signature on the new deed, and then it's done. Another pause. She'll never see it coming. I'm thinking once the house sells, I'll move her into one of those assisted living places. Nothing fancy, just enough to shut her up. The blood drained from Evelyn's face. Her breath caught in her throat. Her hand trembling now pressed against her chest. Of course I've already talked to the buyer. They're ready to close. It's a cash offer. No inspections. We just need her out of the way. The voice that followed, male muffled, was on speakerphone, laughing. Evelyn couldn't breathe. She staggered back from the door, slightly careful not to let her slippers scuff the wood. She's outlived her usefulness, Melissa said with a casual finality. And honestly, I need this win. I'm done babysitting her. Evelyn turned and moved quickly back down the stairs, the pain in her legs forgotten. She didn't even realize she'd spilled water down the front of her robe. She reached the bottom and gripped the stair railing, her knuckles white. Melissa's voice still echoed in her head, growing fainter as she descended. Yeah, I'll bring the papers to the notary myself. She just needs to sign the final deed, and she won't even read it. In the dim light of the hallway, Evelyn leaned against the wall. Her eyes were wide and unfocused. Her breath came in shallow gasps. She had trusted her. Everything. The house, the documents, the legacy of her family, was now a loaded weapon in the hands of the one person she thought she could count on. Her body shook, not from weakness, from betrayal, from disbelief. She pushed off the wall slowly and walked back toward the kitchen, but her steps paused halfway. She looked up at the dark hallway that led to the guest room Melissa had turned into her office. The door was slightly ajar. She glanced over her shoulder. Melissa was still upstairs. The glow beneath her bedroom door remained steady. Evelyn moved, quiet, deliberate. She walked down the hallway and opened the office door fully. Her hand reached for the light switch, but she stopped herself. The moonlight filtering through the Venetian blinds was enough. Soft shadows crawled across the room. The desk stood in the center, modern metallic edges, unlike the rest of the house. Melissa's laptop was closed, but Evelyn's eyes landed on the set of drawers tucked beneath the desk. She walked over and pulled the top one open. Pens, a notebook, post-its. She opened the second. Paper clips, envelopes. She reached for the bottom drawer. Locked, of course. She knelt slowly, placing her palm against the surface. The lock was cheap, the kind you buy at a drugstore, decorative more than functional. Evelyn stood and turned to the bookshelf beside the desk. A small metal container sat on the top shelf. She opened it. Spare keys. She sifted through them quickly, her fingers trembling until one fit the lock. A click. The drawer slid open with a reluctant groan. Inside, a thin stack of papers sat on top of a sleek black folder. Her name was on the first page. Her signature. She reached for it, lifting the document into the moonlight. The title, transfer of title, Carter residence. Her eyes scanned the text. The signature at the bottom hers, but she had never signed this. Not this. Her knees buckled slightly and she leaned on the desk to steady herself. She flipped through the folder. Real estate emails. A realtor's business card. A timeline for closing. Lists of moving companies. Even a flyer for a retirement home circled in red ink. And behind it all, neatly paper-clipped, was a printed email to Melissa Carter, from Langston Properties, subject, confirmation of buyer interest. Once the deed is in your name, we can finalize the sale. Our client is ready to wire the funds upon verification. Do let us know when your grandmother has vacated the property." Evelyn sank into the office chair. She didn't cry. Not yet. Not here. She set the folder down and stared at the computer. Locked. Password protected. She didn't need it. What she had found was more than enough. Melissa wasn't just planning to betray her, she had already begun. Every smile, every cup of tea, every gentle, "Don't worry, Grandma, I've got it handled," was a lie. And Evelyn had handed her the keys. Her hands trembled as she returned the documents exactly as she found them, slid the drawer shut, relocked it, replaced the spare key. She stood and stepped backward into the shadows of the hallway. The house was still quiet. Melissa's light was off now. Evelyn walked slowly back to her bedroom, her thoughts racing. Her heart no longer beat like a bird's. It pounded slow and deep like a drum calling something ancient to attention. She closed the door behind her and sat on the edge of the bed. In the mirror across the room, she didn't see a frail old woman anymore. She saw someone rising, someone who had just discovered the depth of someone else's deception and would never be the same. She leaned forward, resting her elbows on her knees, and stared into the darkness. There in the silence, something inside her began to harden, and somewhere deep in the marrow of her bones a plan began to take shape. The house was dark except for the soft amber light of Evelyn's bedside lamp, which pooled across her quilt like spilled honey. She sat on the edge of her bed, motionless, the manila folder resting in her lap like a lead weight. She hadn't turned on the main lights, didn't need to. The moon was full beyond the lace curtains, casting thin silver shadows that crawled along the floor. The folder was warm from her hands, though her fingers had long gone cold. Her back was straight, spine stiff with something that wasn't quite anger and wasn't yet sorrow. She opened the folder, one page at a time. Each sheet was a confession that hadn't been spoken, an insult that hadn't yet been delivered. She held the forged contract closer, tracing the loops of her name. Evelyn Carter in her own handwriting, except it wasn't. The signature was too smooth, too fluid. Hers was shakier now, thanks to the stroke. She knew how her own hand trembled when she wrote. This was Melissa's version of her, a ghost, a forgery, a fiction made legal. Her throat tightened, her jaw clenched until her molars pressed like plates of granite. The ticking of the grandfather clock echoed from the hallway, loud, intrusive, like the heartbeat of the house had grown louder just to witness this night. Tick, tick, tick. Evelyn turned the page. The real estate documents, the emails, the offers of cash. Highlighted names, realtor information, clinical language, words like transition, liquidate, finalize, no space for memory, no room for legacy. Melissa had been planning it for months. The betrayal wasn't impulsive, it had been deliberate, meticulous, quiet as a surgeon's blade. Evelyn pressed a hand over her chest. For a long time she couldn't breathe right. Her lungs fought her. Her heart squeezed in tight, irregular beats. She closed her eyes, and when she did, the past rose like smoke around her. Jonah. Her son's name drifted into her mind like a hymn. Jonah in his baseball cap smirking at her across the kitchen table as he wolfed down scrambled eggs. Jonah, 6 years old, falling asleep in her lap during a thunderstorm. Jonah, 24, and too stubborn, driving too fast on that rainy night. She had never blamed him for dying, not really, but she'd blamed herself for surviving. And after the funeral, after the silence took over the house, and the casseroles stopped coming, she poured herself into what remained of him, Melissa. Just 10 years old, caught between a bitter custody battle. Her mother, Jonah's ex-wife, remarried quickly and moved across the country, barely writing. Melissa had become a half-abandoned sapling, leaning in whichever direction someone pointed. So Evelyn pointed her toward safety. She gave her structure, schooling, love, traditions. She showed up to every recital, packed, every lunch attended, every parent-teacher meeting. She baked birthday cakes from scratch and hand-sewed Halloween costumes. She let Melissa cry in the middle of the night and never once told her to toughen up. She let herself believe foolishly that love was enough. Now in the middle of the night she sat beneath the burden of that love. Its weight revealed not as soft and warm, but jagged and cold. Love, she realized, could be a lie we tell ourselves to feel needed. The contract pages crinkled in her grip. She didn't cry, not at first. The tears didn't come in gentle streams. They arrived like a dam bursting. A single sob tore through her chest, loud and startling in the stillness. She clutched the paper to her chest as if she could squeeze truth from it, as if she could reverse time through sheer will. The clock struck 3. Each chime rang out into the dark, echoing through the silence like a verdict. Evelyn sat there and let them fall over her wave after wave. She whispered once to no one in particular. "Why, Melissa?" The shadows didn't answer. Her eyes, bloodshot now, scanned the documents again. Every comma, every number, every legal phrase glared back at her like an accusation. You trusted the wrong person. You handed her the key. She spent the rest of the night in silence. When the sky began to pale, when the first blush of dawn kissed the rooftops, Evelyn was still in her robe, still sitting, still holding the folder like a sacred book of betrayal. She blinked slowly. Her body ached in places she'd forgotten she had. Her legs trembled when she stood. The muscles in her shoulders were wound tight like twisted wire, but her mind was different. Something inside her had settled not into despair, but into clarity. She walked to the bathroom and splashed cold water on her face, watching her reflection in the mirror. The woman who stared back wasn't broken. No, she was awake. She dried her face with a towel and took a slow, steady breath. Downstairs, the kitchen began to stir with the sounds of a new day. The coffee maker hummed. The old pipes sighed. Evelyn dressed deliberately. A navy cardigan over a gray blouse, slacks with soft cotton lining. No jewelry except the locket. She brushed her hair until it lay neat and flat against her temples. By the time she entered the kitchen, Melissa was already there, her back turned, flipping pancakes with ease. Her phone lay face down on the counter, a lipstick stain on the rim of her coffee mug. "Morning, Grandma," she called cheerfully. "You sleep okay?" Evelyn smiled softly, like a rock. Melissa glanced over her shoulder, surprised. "You look nice today." Evelyn chuckled. "Well, even old ladies have their good days." She moved to the table and began setting 2 places. Her movements were smooth, practiced, serene, as if she hadn't just discovered the dagger in her back hours ago, as if she hadn't cried herself raw in the dark. Inside, her heart was steady, cold even, but not numb. "Alert!" Melissa brought over the pancakes and poured syrup without asking. She sat across from Evelyn, already scrolling her phone with one hand, chewing with the other. Evelyn watched her for a long moment, so young, so polished, so calculating. She wondered if Melissa even felt guilt, or if the lies had become second nature. If maybe Evelyn had made it too easy all these years, too much warmth, too little consequence. Melissa looked up. "Something wrong?" "No," Evelyn said, "just remembering." "Remembering what?" Evelyn smiled. "Jonah. When he was your age, he used to eat pancakes like they were going out of style." Melissa gave a shallow laugh. "Yeah, I remember, kinda." Evelyn nodded. "You were young, barely 10 when he passed." "Yeah." Melissa looked down at her plate. "It was a lot." Evelyn sipped her tea. "You were so scared at the funeral. You wouldn't let go of my hand. I didn't know how to explain death to you, so I just sat with you in the pew and let you cry." Melissa didn't respond. "You know," Evelyn continued, "I used to think I rescued you, but maybe I was wrong. Maybe I just handed you a crown you didn't earn." Melissa's eyes narrowed. "What's that supposed to mean?" Evelyn waved a hand gently. "Nothing, dear, just memories. They get heavier as we age." She stood, picked up her plate, and carried it to the sink. Behind her, Melissa's voice floated across the kitchen. "Are you feeling okay today?" Evelyn turned, drying her hands with a towel. "Better than I have in years." Melissa tilted her head, studying her grandmother. Evelyn smiled, and in that smile, behind the polite grandmotherly warmth, was the faintest glimmer of something else. A spark, a seed, a beginning. She turned away before Melissa could read too much into it. The plan had already begun. She just needed to stay quiet long enough to let it grow. The storm had passed through her in the night, but what remained in its wake wasn't ruin. It was resolve. The days passed with a strange kind of quiet. Evelyn, now fully awake in the way a sleeping animal becomes alert to the scent of danger, watched everything. She didn't speak of the folder, didn't let the tension rise to the surface of her voice. She moved like she always did, measured, polite, grandmotherly, but inside something was cracking open like dry earth under pressure. Melissa, for her part, remained charming. She still brewed Evelyn's tea at precisely 4 p.m., still asked if she needed help down the stairs, still smiled with that ease that once made Evelyn feel safe. But now that smile felt like a mask, and Evelyn was learning how to see through masks. She started to notice the small things first. Melissa's morning phone calls always taken outside now, as if the walls themselves couldn't be trusted. The way she'd lock the guest room whenever she left the house, the hurried clicks of her mouse when Evelyn passed too close behind her in the hallway. On Wednesday, Melissa left early, claiming she had errands to run in the city. Evelyn stood by the lace-covered front window watching her pull away in the white Honda Evelyn had co-signed for. The car disappeared down the street, and the house was finally quiet, empty. Evelyn waited exactly 5 minutes, just enough time to be sure Melissa wouldn't turn back for a forgotten purse or folder. Then she moved, upstairs. Each step creaked beneath her weight, but she didn't slow down. She went straight for the guest room, the one Melissa called her home office. The door was locked, of course, always was now. But Evelyn had lived through the 70s, she knew how to deal with old locks. She fetched the thin metal ruler from her sewing kit and inserted it between the frame and latch. It took 2 tries. On the third, she heard the soft click of release. She pushed the door open. The room was neat, eerily so. The bed made with military precision. The desk cleared of any clutter. The laptop was gone, likely with Melissa. But Evelyn didn't care about the laptop. She was after what Melissa didn't expect her to touch. She crossed the room to the small chest of drawers beside the desk. The bottom drawer had a lock, the same one she remembered from nights spent reading Melissa bedtime stories while she did her homework beside the same desk years ago. It was sentimental furniture, Jonah's old desk, but it had changed hands like so much else. She knelt her joints screaming, but she didn't stop. The lock was newer than the desk, a combination style. She stared at it for a long moment, heart thumping in her ears. Then she stood again and searched. She opened the top drawer. Stationery, a journal, loose receipts. Nothing. Then the second drawer, file folders color-coded. And tucked beneath a stack of manila envelopes, she found a sticky note with 4 numbers scrawled in black pen. 6:23. Evelyn paused. June 23rd, Melissa's birthday. Of course. She returned to the bottom drawer, entered the code, and heard the lock disengage with a soft pop. She opened it. Inside a sleek black USB drive, a white file folder labeled Offer, Langston Property Group, and a voice recorder, the same brand Evelyn had once used to record family recipes years ago. Her fingers hesitated over the recorder. She picked it up. It was warm as if recently used. Her thumb hovered over the play button, and then she pressed it. At first static, then a woman's voice. Melissa's crisp and clear. I'm telling you, the place is worth more than your buyer's offering. But if we close before next Thursday, I'll accept. Pause. A man's voice muffled. You're sure she won't contest this? Melissa again. She won't even know. I've got power of attorney. The house is as good as sold. She still thinks I'm fixing it up for her comfort. The man laughed. Melissa continued more quietly now. Once she's in Silver Pines, I can have the place cleared in 2 weeks. Silver Pines. Evelyn's hand clenched. She knew that name. An assisted living facility on the outskirts of town. Cold, stark, the kind of place where people went to be forgotten, where the silence outlasted the breathing. The recording kept going. I just need her to sign a few routine maintenance docs. She never reads them. Trust me, this'll be seamless. Evelyn pressed pause. She sat back on the floor, the drawer still open, the USB untouched beside her. The silence in the room now was different, thick, full of betrayal that had finally found its voice. She stared ahead at the wallpaper, yellowed slightly with time patterned with faded blue roses. Jonah had helped her hang that paper when Melissa was still in grade school. His voice echoed in her memory. You sure you want flowers in every room? Ma followed by that familiar chuckle. He had trusted her, trusted that if anything happened to him, she would take care of his daughter. And she had, until now. Her fingers closed slowly around the USB. She stood up slowly, deliberately, and walked over to the desk, plugged it into the side port of the office monitor. The screen blinked to life. 2 folders appeared. Contracts, audio, proofs. She opened the first, scanned the PDF. It was the same offer she'd seen days ago. Langston Property Group buyer, confirmed transfer pending completion of signature verification. Her name was everywhere, forged, stamped, spliced. The second folder contained 6 audio files. She clicked on the most recent one. Melissa's voice again, calm, poised. Yes, I've already arranged her transportation to Silver Pines. Just waiting on the closing date. No, she doesn't know yet. And even if she did, what's she gonna do, sue me? The man on the other end laughed again. You're ruthless, he said. Melissa responded almost proudly, I prefer the word strategic. Evelyn clicked stop. Her hand trembled slightly, but not with weakness. With rage. With awakening. She removed the USB, tucked it carefully into the pocket of her cardigan, and turned off the monitor. She replaced everything exactly how she had found it. Closed the folders, locked the drawer, reset the combination to the original. She moved quietly, almost reverently, as if performing a sacred act. Because this was sacred now. Truth was sacred. She stepped out into the hallway and pulled the door shut behind her. Down the stairs one by one, her cane tapping softly. She paused halfway and listened. Nothing. No car. No sound. Just birdsong in the distance and the rustling of branches against the side of the house. She reached the kitchen, sat down at the table. Her fingers unfolded slowly around the USB. She laid it on the tablecloth, the morning sun pouring over it like a spotlight. The silver casing glinted. She stared at it, not as a relic of betrayal, but as a weapon. Melissa had called her helpless, a shadow, an old woman too busy knitting and sipping tea to understand what was happening beneath her own roof. But Melissa had forgotten one thing. Evelyn Carter had spent her entire life cataloging details. Small things, quiet things, overlooked things. Now she would use them. She sat in that kitchen for a long time. Then she smiled, not out of joy, out of resolve. Her reflection in the window was sharper now, not a victim, not even a survivor. A strategist. A librarian with an arsenal of truth. She picked up the USB, pressed it to her chest once, and then slipped it into the small compartment of her sewing box beneath the velvet where she used to keep spare buttons. Then she stood, and just like that, the plan began to take root. The sky was overcast. The afternoon, Evelyn decided to knock on an old door she hadn't approached in years. The clouds above Pinebrook hung heavy, their shadows long and soft, like blankets draped over the town's shoulders. She walked slowly but with purpose, her cane tapping against the sidewalk like a metronome to her thoughts. The USB lay nestled in her purse along with the printed copies of the forged documents and the realtor emails. It wasn't just paper anymore, it was fuel, proof, ammunition. She stopped outside a modest brick house on a quiet cul-de-sac, where the hedges were trimmed into perfect cubes, and the mailbox still bore the same gold-embossed letters W. Hawthorne. Walter had always been meticulous. Evelyn took a breath and pressed the doorbell. A pause. Then footsteps measured heavy and the door creaked open. Walter Hawthorne stood before her in a cardigan the color of wheat. His white hair combed neatly to one side, eyes sharp behind a pair of square-rimmed glasses. He blinked, surprised. Evelyn Carter, he said softly. My God, I haven't seen you in 8-9 years. Closer to 10, she replied, offering a small smile. He stepped aside without a word, and she entered, her shoulders tight with hesitation. His home smelled of pipe tobacco and lemon polish exactly as she remembered. Books lined every shelf, case files and legal journals stacked in neat piles on the end tables, though dust coated their spines now. The living room looked like a courtroom caught in retirement. They sat across from each other on twin armchairs worn smooth by time. Walter cleared his throat. I thought you moved in with your granddaughter. I did, Evelyn replied carefully, removing the USB from her purse. That's actually why I'm here. His brow furrowed. Tea, he asked, out of habit rising. No, this isn't a social visit. He sat again, slower this time. Evelyn leaned forward and placed the USB on the table between them like a chess piece. She forged my signature. She's trying to sell my house. Put me in a nursing home. It's all in their audio contracts, emails. I need help, Walter. He didn't reach for the drive. Instead, he stared at her, his eyes searching. Evelyn, you know I'm retired. Hell, I haven't been in a courtroom in 6 years. You should talk to someone who still carries weight. She nodded, unsurprised. She had expected this. I know you owe me nothing. But do you remember 1979? He blinked. You were just starting out. Couldn't afford the rent on your office space. Your partner ran off with the escrow accounts. They were going to disbar you. He looked down the memory fresh and bitter. I came into the library and found you there 3 hours before closing, digging through bankruptcy statutes. I let you stay after hours. I even slipped you the records from the back room, what you needed to prove he'd forged the transfers. Walter chuckled under his breath. That was you. Evelyn smiled just barely. That was me. He ran a hand down his face. You saved my neck back then. She nodded. Now I'm asking you to help me save what's left of mine. Walter reached for the USB. The silence that followed was long and sharp. He turned on the small laptop beside him, plugged in the drive, and opened the first audio file. Melissa's voice filled the room, confident, arrogant, cold. Once she's in Silver Pines, I can have the place cleared in 2 weeks. Walter exhaled slowly, his lips tightening. He clicked on the second file. She just needs to sign the deed. She doesn't read anything. Honestly, it's like taking candy from a baby. He paused the recording. The only sound was the faint creak of his leather chair as he leaned back, folding his hands across his lap. Tell me everything. Evelyn did. She told him about the forged documents, the late-night calls, the lies, the performance. She told him about the safe, the signatures, the recordings, and the plans Melissa had made behind her back. She spoke with clarity, not anger, her words crisp, clean like facts in a deposition. Walter listened without interruption. His gaze never left her. When she was done, he rubbed his chin. Well, he said she's an idiot. Evelyn blinked. She left a digital trail a mile wide. And these recordings admissible, especially if you can get her voice in real time saying the same thing. That's what we need. You mean, we bait her, Walter said. We let her dig her own grave. All we need is one more conversation, one confirmation, in her own words. And we record it. Evelyn stared at him. She's careful, she warned. Everyone is. Until they think they've already won. He stood moving toward the back room, muttering to himself as he dug through a filing cabinet. Still have it somewhere. Bought it back when I was helping my brother with the tenant fraud case. He returned with a small black device the size of a thumb. High-def pinhole camera. Motion activated. Battery lasts 8 hours. You can sew it into clothing or hide it in a vase. Evelyn took it delicately like a relic. She'll notice anything out of place, she murmured. Then we put it somewhere she's used to seeing. He sat again. Tell me, what does she want from you now? A final signature. She's pretending it's for maintenance on the house. She thinks I'm still blind to it all. Walter grinned, slow and deliberate. Then you play the fool. You stall, let her bring the papers, act confused, nod along. And when she makes the mistake, when she lets the real words slip, you'll be ready. Evelyn looked down at the small camera in her palm. She thought of all the times she had signed forms without reading them. The trust she had given so freely. The love she had offered like an open door. That door was closed now. She stood. Walter followed her to the door. The sky outside had begun to darken, further clouds thickening into a soft gray that stretched across the horizon. As she stepped out onto the porch, Walter placed a hand gently on her shoulder. You're not alone in this, he said. Evelyn turned to him. Her eyes were clear, firm. I was for a long time, but not anymore. She walked back home as the wind began to stir. The weight of the camera in her pocket steadied her steps. Inside her chest, something new began to bloom. Not revenge, not bitterness. Strategy. As she crossed her threshold, she moved straight to her sewing room. The door clicked softly behind her. She reached for the old wooden box beneath the workbench, one that hadn't been opened in years. Inside were threads, pinned scraps of cloth, and a hidden drawer beneath the lining. She opened it. Nestled in velvet was a small needle kit, and beneath that a silk pouch containing the remains of Jonah's favorite fountain pen. She removed it, revealing a false bottom. She placed the camera there gently. Then she whispered aloud, voice steady as stone. Let's begin. And the game turned. The trap had to be set slowly, carefully, like slipping a thread through the eye of a needle, without letting your hands tremble. Evelyn had always been good at this sort of thing. Details, precision. She hadn't made it through decades as a head librarian by forgetting things. She had to become invisible again. That was the hard part. To Melissa, she needed to look smaller, slower. Like the version of herself Melissa had always believed in, frail, docile, fading. It wasn't difficult, not physically. The stroke had left enough shadows to play the part well. but mentally she was sharper than she'd been in years. She shuffled more. She asked Melissa to repeat things she already knew. She added a slight tremble to her voice at the right moments. Melissa bought it hook, line, and sinker. "You don't need to stress yourself," Melissa said one morning, stirring sugar into Evelyn's tea like she hadn't betrayed her. "Just let me handle the rest, Grandma." Evelyn smiled and nodded, her fingers gently clasping the chipped porcelain cup. "You're such a blessing, dear," she murmured. "I don't know what I'd do without you." The words nearly turned to ash on her tongue. That afternoon, Evelyn planted the camera in the living room vase, the one Jonah had given her for her 60th birthday. It was tall, glazed, a deep ocean blue, and slightly chipped at the rim. Melissa never touched it. It sat in the corner by the bookshelf, quiet and dignified. Perfect. She aimed the pinhole lens toward the couch and coffee table, set the audio to full sensitivity, then tested it. Twice. Walter had told her, "Don't intervene, just observe, let the web tighten." The next day it happened. Melissa came home early, her cheeks flushed, energy bouncing from her heels. She was texting someone rapidly, her phone lighting up with every reply. Evelyn watched from the kitchen, her expression blank. "Expecting company?" she asked, voice soft. Melissa paused just a beat too long. Just a friend." "Business related," she said quickly. "We might use the living room for a few minutes. You should go rest in your room." Evelyn blinked slowly. "Of course, dear, I'll lie down." She shuffled toward the hallway, but not before passing the vase. Her fingers grazed the rim, gently checking its angle. Perfect. In her bedroom, Evelyn cracked the door just an inch and sat in the armchair beside it, heart hammering quietly. Her hearing wasn't what it used to be, but with the recorder synced to her phone through Walter's transmitter, she could hear everything through an earpiece. A car pulled into the driveway. Doors opened. Footsteps. Voices. Melissa's laughter light poised, performative. Then a man's voice, deep-clipped, confident. She heard the front door open, shoes on hardwood. They sat. "Nice place," the man said. "Thank you," Melissa replied. "We're just about ready to finalize things. She's practically handed me the whole house." "Seriously," he said, surprised. "Power of attorney. Complete trust." Melissa's voice dropped lower, richer. "She still thinks I'm setting up the home office for myself, that it's all to help her live more comfortably." The man chuckled. "So no complications?" "None. She's blind to everything. I'm just waiting for the buyer confirmation and we'll be ready to close within the week." "And she has no idea?" "Please," Melissa scoffed. "She's so out of it she barely remembers what she signed last month." There was a pause. Paper shuffled. "You'll get the full cut once it's done," Melissa continued. "And I'll get her into Silver Pines right after." "Already spoke to the director." "Cold," the man said with a grin in his voice. "She's lived her life," Melissa replied. "Time to make room for mine." From the bedroom, Evelyn squeezed the armrest so tightly her knuckles went white. Her other hand trembled, not from fear, but fury, cold and concentrated. She listened as Melissa bragged about the price point, the no inspection clause, the tax loopholes she planned to exploit. Every word was a needle, every syllable a fracture. Old people like her, Melissa said, they don't know how the world works anymore. She still sends checks in the mail, thinks doctors make house calls. The man laughed again, loud and sharp. "Savage." "It's survival," Melissa replied. "She raised me on guilt and casseroles. I'm just flipping the script." Evelyn closed her eyes. For a moment, she pictured Jonah, how he used to braid Melissa's hair after school, how he whispered to Evelyn the night before the crash. "Promise me, Ma, if anything happens, don't let her end up like her mother." Evelyn had promised, and she'd tried. But now, a chair scraped in the living room. "I'll email the final papers tonight," Melissa said. "Great. Let me know when the ink's dry." Evelyn heard footsteps again toward the door. A pause. The sound of keys. And then the man's voice one last time. "She really doesn't suspect a thing." Melissa laughed short and cruel. "She's an old woman. She doesn't know anything." The door shut. Silence. Evelyn sat still. The tape was complete. She waited 10 full minutes before rising. Her legs shook as she walked to the living room. Melissa was gone, likely off to celebrate her success with a glass of something cold and expensive. Evelyn crossed the room slowly, deliberately. She stopped in front of the vase, kneeled, unclipped the tiny camera, held it in her palm. Then she stood and walked to the hallway window. Outside, the sun was dipping low, staining the sky in bruised orange and pink. Shadows stretched across the driveway. The world had changed in a single hour. Evelyn didn't cry. She didn't scream. She simply pressed the camera to her chest and whispered, "She'll know everything soon enough." Then she turned off the lights and disappeared into the dark, her cane tapping like a countdown behind her. The dining room smelled of rosemary and garlic, the scent curling through the house like a soft invitation. Evelyn had spent the afternoon slow roasting a small chicken, peeling red potatoes with shaking hands, and setting the table with the good china white porcelain with pale blue trim, a wedding gift from a lifetime ago. The crystal glasses glinted under the dim chandelier light. She polished them twice, even though no one would notice but her. It was a performance. Every gesture was deliberate. The creased linen napkins, the extra fork, the gentle clink of the spoon against the sugar bowl, all of it choreographed like an old waltz. Melissa arrived just after 7. Her heels clicked across the hardwood like gunshots. She wore a tailored blazer over a silk blouse, too formal for dinner at home, but Evelyn didn't comment. Melissa always dressed for the role she thought she deserved. "Oh, wow," she said, stepping into the dining room. "You went all out." Evelyn smiled. "It's been a while since we shared a real meal. Thought it might be nice." Melissa's eyes flicked over the table, then down to the manila folder tucked beneath her arm. "Right," she said. "I brought the documents, just some property maintenance and tax stuff. We can go over it after dinner." Evelyn nodded, gesturing to the seat across from her. "Let's eat first." They sat. The silence between them was strained but civil, filled with the soft sounds of silverware and forced compliments. "This is delicious," Grandma Melissa said, around a bite of chicken. "You didn't have to do all this." "I know," Evelyn replied. "But sometimes you do things for family, even if they don't deserve it." Melissa blinked. "What's that supposed to mean?" Evelyn looked up, her eyes soft but unblinking. "Just a thought." Melissa laughed nervously and reached for her wineglass. After a few more minutes of uneasy small talk, she leaned back in her chair and dabbed her mouth with a napkin. "Well," she said, "since we're both in good moods, maybe it's a good time to go over the papers." Evelyn didn't move right away. She sat perfectly still, the candlelight catching the silver strands in her hair. Then slowly she reached beneath the edge of the table and lifted a small, familiar object, the USB drive. She placed it gently next to her plate. Melissa froze. Her fingers stopped mid-reach. Her smile vanished. "What's that?" Evelyn didn't answer immediately. She looked down at the table, then back up. "I think you already know." A beat of silence. Then Melissa laughed too loudly, too quickly. "Grandma, what are you talking about?" Evelyn folded her napkin carefully, setting it beside her plate. Her voice was calm, controlled. "I heard you, Melissa. Every word, every plan, every lie. I heard you tell a stranger that I'm useless, that I wouldn't notice, that you'd put me in a facility and take the house without a second thought." Melissa's face drained of color. You're confused." "That's not what happened. Someone's tricked you." "I have your voice," Evelyn interrupted. "And his, discussing the sale, discussing Silver Pines. You called me dead weight." Melissa slammed her hand on the table, rattling the silverware. "I didn't mean it like that." Evelyn tilted her head. "Then how exactly did you mean it? You don't understand. This place is falling apart. You don't even use half the rooms. I've been doing everything for you." Evelyn's expression didn't change. "And this is how you thank me?" Melissa stood her chair, scraping loudly against the floor. "You can't prove anything," she snapped. "Even if you did record something, it's probably illegal. I'll get a lawyer. I'll say you forged it." "I didn't forge your voice," Evelyn said, her tone low. "And I didn't fake your signature on my house deed." Melissa's face twisted. "You're not going to ruin this for me," she hissed. "I've worked too hard for this. I'm the one who gave up my life to take care of you." Evelyn rose slowly, pushing her chair back with grace. "No, Melissa, you gave up nothing. You took, you manipulated, you lied. You're senile." Evelyn stared at her for a long moment, then smiled, thin and tired. "I may be old, but I'm not blind, and I'm not stupid." Melissa's mouth opened, then closed. Her fists clenched at her sides, her breath fast and shallow. "I'll take you to court," she spat. "You won't win." Evelyn walked to the head of the table where a small box sat on the buffet. She opened it and pulled out an envelope sealed, labeled. "Then I suppose you'll enjoy answering for this," she said, placing it in front of Melissa. copies of the audio, screenshots of your emails, the signed agreement with the realtor. Melissa didn't touch it. She stared at it like it might burn her. Then in a flash, she slapped it off the table. The envelope hit the floor papers, spilling across the rug. "You think you've won," she screamed. "You think this is over." Evelyn didn't flinch. She stepped back, collected the USB, and turned toward the hallway. Melissa's breathing was ragged behind her. "I needed that money," she shouted. "You don't even know what it's like to fight for a future. You had everything handed to you." Evelyn stopped at the doorway and turned. "My future was buried in the ground the day Jonah died," she said, her voice quiet, trembling with emotion. "And I still showed up for you every damn day." Melissa fell silent. Evelyn looked at her for the last time, really looked at her, and felt something break inside. Not pain, not even disappointment. Emptiness. She turned and walked down the hallway, past the family portraits, past Jonah's graduation photo, past the dusty frames of Melissa as a child. At the end of the hall she paused, and without a word she turned off the dining room lights, plunging the table and Melissa into darkness. The next morning arrived wrapped in gray fog, thick and quiet, like the town itself was holding its breath. Evelyn sat in the passenger seat of Walter's aging Volvo, her hands folded neatly in her lap. The leather creaked beneath her with every bump in the road, but she didn't flinch. Her spine was straight, her jaw set. This was the day. Walter drove in silence, glancing at her only once when they reached the courthouse square. "You ready for this?" he asked, putting the car in park. She didn't look at him when she answered. "I was ready the moment she called me useless." He nodded once and turned off the ignition. The office of Carter and Regan Notaries was tucked between a florist and an old piano repair shop. A brass plaque on the red brick wall gleamed under the dim morning light. Inside the space was warm, sterile, smelling faintly of ink and furniture polish. The receptionist, a young woman with coral lipstick and careful handwriting, guided them through 2 sets of swinging glass doors and into a meeting room that overlooked the courthouse lawn. Evelyn sat across from a woman named Janet Cross, an estate specialist with sharp eyes and fingers that moved like they'd been trained to sign treaties. Walter sat beside Evelyn, a silent force. Janet reviewed the file Walter had prepared. "So," she said, after a few minutes tapping the folder with a manicured nail, "you want to transfer the Carter property into a charitable trust." "That's correct," Walter replied. Evelyn leaned in. "I want the house to go to the Pinebrook Community Library Foundation as a literacy center. After I move out, they'll take full control of the deed. Forever. No sales, no inheritance, no probate." Janet raised an eyebrow. "That's generous." Evelyn smiled, but there was nothing soft in it. "It's necessary." Janet nodded, began to prepare the paperwork, and slid form after form across the polished oak table. Evelyn signed every line with steady hands, no hesitation, no trembling. Each stroke of the pen felt like unsealing a vault that had held her hostage for too long. When it was done, Janet gathered the papers into a thick folder stamped with the Carter family crest. Walter opened his briefcase again and produced the second folder. "The injunction," he said. Evelyn's eyes didn't leave the lawyer's face. "Melissa no longer has access to any legal authority over my property or financial accounts. As of now, every document she touched is frozen." Janet reviewed the order. "This is enforceable," Walter nodded. "Filed through probate court and reviewed by the Elder Fraud Task Force last week. It's ironclad." Janet blinked, then smiled slowly. "Good." They moved next to the financial disclosures, the bank transfer documents. Walter handed over Evelyn's notarized statements of revocation, 2 separate accounts, one for basic living expenses, another that would fund the literacy center once the trust officially activated. Janet copied each signature. When the final page slid across the table, Evelyn paused just briefly before signing. It read, "Voluntary relinquishment of beneficiary access, Melissa Carter." She signed it, in long looping strokes, and the chain snapped. They stepped out of the building just after noon. The fog had lifted and the sun broke through in slivers, casting fractured light across the sidewalk. Evelyn looked up at the courthouse dome, golden and smooth like the top of a wedding cake. Walter stood beside her silent. "She doesn't know yet," Evelyn said. "She will." They walked back to the car. Walter opened the door for her, then slid into the driver's seat and sat quietly, his fingers resting on the steering wheel, but not turning the key. "She'll try to fight this," he said finally. Evelyn nodded. "Let her." Walter turned to her, his expression serious. "She'll come at you with words, with guilt, with every trick in the book." "She already has," Evelyn replied. "She's spent years doing it. I just wasn't listening before." He studied her for a long beat. "You know, he said you're tougher than you look." "I had to be." Walter smiled faintly and started the engine. Back home, the house was quiet. Too quiet. Melissa wasn't there, not yet. Evelyn stood in the foyer for a long moment, letting the silence settle around her. The walls seemed thinner now, more honest. The portraits on the staircase landing, Jonah's senior photo, Melissa at 12, the family reunion from 1995, watched her as she moved. She walked to the kitchen and put on a kettle. She didn't want tea, but rituals mattered. While the water boiled, she pulled open the drawer near the fridge and took out a single sheet of stationery, thick cream stock, her initials embossed in pale blue at the top. She sat at the table, pen in hand. For several seconds the page remained blank. Then slowly she wrote, "Melissa, I hope someday you understand what you lost. Not the house, not the money, me, Evelyn." She folded the letter carefully, placed it in an envelope and set it on the dining room table, right next to the spot where Melissa had once laid her forged contracts. Then she stood, walked upstairs, packed only what she needed, her journals, her locket. A photo of Jonah smiling in the back seat of a fishing boat, legs kicked up like he had no idea the world could be cruel. And then in the hallway, she stopped before the door of Melissa's guest room. She opened it slowly. It was empty, clean, the desk wiped bare, the drawers still locked. Evelyn stepped inside. She reached up to the closet shelf and pulled down a dusty shoebox. Inside were papers Melissa had left over the years, old report cards, notes from school, handmade birthday cards. One caught her eye, crayon scrawled on construction paper. "I love you, Grandma." Her throat tightened. She held it for a moment, then gently placed it back inside. She closed the box and left it where she'd found it, not out of nostalgia, but out of acknowledgement that once Melissa had loved her. Once. Downstairs, the kettle screamed. Evelyn didn't move. She stared out the front window as the wind picked up, rustling the hydrangeas near the gate. The air smelled different, lighter. She walked to the door, picked up her purse, and stepped outside. The sun caught the edge of her glasses. The air kissed her skin with late spring warmth. She paused on the porch, looked back only once, then closed the door. Behind her, the letter waited in silence. The legacy had been reclaimed, and Evelyn Carter at last was free. Melissa pulled into the driveway with the sharp, decisive turn of someone used to being in control. The white Honda jerked slightly as she slammed it into park. Her phone buzzed in the passenger seat, an email notification from the realtor reminding her of tomorrow's 10 a.m. contract signing. She didn't bother reading it. Everything was lined up. The deal was practically done. She stepped out, heels clicking on concrete, and adjusted her jacket in the car window. The house loomed in front of her, same as it always had, calm, still, unaware. But something felt off. It was too quiet. No smell of dinner from the kitchen. No flicker of light from the front parlor. Melissa frowned and stepped up onto the porch, jiggling her key into the lock. The door swung open with a groan. "Grandma," she called. Silence. She dropped her bag at the base of the stairs and strode into the kitchen. Empty. No teapot. No creaking floorboards. No carefully folded dish towel on the counter. Just the faint smell of lemon oil and the lingering ghost of old furniture. "Grandma." Still nothing. A tremor barely noticeable crept up her spine. She turned into the hallway. The door to the study stood ajar. She pushed it open. Her heart dropped. The safe was open. Empty. Panic bloomed in her chest like black ink in water. She spun around and ran to the dining room, scanning the table, searching for the folder, the documents, the contracts she had meticulously prepared. Gone. In their place was a single envelope, her name written in clean, careful handwriting. She stared at it for a long time, not touching it. Then slowly she picked it up and slid a manicured fingernail beneath the seal. "Melissa căn nhà không còn thuộc về cháu. Bà không chọn trả thù, bà chọn tự do." No greeting. No signature. Just silence in 6 lines. Melissa stood there for several seconds, letter in hand, before the breath she'd been holding escaped her in a broken gasp. She turned and bolted for the hallway closet, pulling open drawers, rifling through Evelyn's filing cabinet. Nothing. Just old church programs, expired coupons, and a dusty photo album. She ran up the stairs 2 at a time, flung open Evelyn's bedroom door. The closet was half empty. The quilt on the bed had been folded. The drawers were bare. The jewelry box open and empty, save for a single pair of pearl earrings left behind like punctuation. Melissa dropped to her knees beside the bed. She crawled to the nightstand, yanked open the drawer. Only one thing inside. A photo of her father, Jonah, smiling on a fishing dock, sunburned and laughing, holding her hand when she was 5. She stared at it. Her chest heaved. "No," she whispered. "No, no, no, no." She stumbled to her feet and grabbed her phone, hands shaking. She dialed Evelyn's number. 1 ring, 2, 3. Voicemail. She dialed again and again. Voicemail. Again. Blocked. She let out a strangled cry and slammed the phone on the bed. "No," she screamed. Her voice cracked and echoed off the walls. She dropped into Evelyn's chair, clutching the photo to her chest like a child. Her tears spilled hot and fast, her shoulders shaking. The house didn't answer. It didn't comfort. It didn't care. She stayed like that for minutes, maybe hours. Her sobs the only sound in a house that had once held warmth and laughter and safety. Now it was hollow. She rose finally and walked down the hallway, her steps sluggish. The photos on the wall stared down at her, Evelyn in her younger years. Jonah at prom, Melissa as a little girl holding a ribbon at a science fair. They didn't speak. They just looked. She passed the study again and stepped inside. Sat in Evelyn's old armchair and stared at the empty shelves. Then she saw the small box on the table, not the contract folder. Something older, worn. She opened it and found the construction paper birthday card she'd made when she was 7. "I love you, Grandma," written in crayon, her ES backward. A broken sound escaped her. She dropped the card and clutched her face in her hands. Tears came again, but they were different now. Not angry, not desperate, just empty. She wandered the house the rest of the day like a ghost. Every room whispered something. The scent of lavender on a pillow, the uneven creak of the 3rd stair, the garden shoes left neatly by the back door. Evelyn had left nothing valuable, only the weight of her absence. And that was the cruelest part. She hadn't tried to destroy Melissa. She had simply stepped away and taken everything that mattered with her. The first time Evelyn Carter saw the sea again, she didn't cry. She thought she might. But instead she stood at the edge of the cliffside path, breathing in the salt, thick air as the wind tugged gently at her scarf. The waves below rolled in slow, powerful rhythm, steady, indifferent, eternal. Walter stood a few feet behind her, hands in the pockets of his corduroy jacket. "Well," he said, "what do you think?" Evelyn didn't answer right away. She closed her eyes, tilted her face toward the sun. It had been years since she'd felt the ocean like this, honest, blunt, free of pretense. Here the wind didn't ask for permission. It moved through you, rearranged you, stripped away whatever didn't belong. "I think," she finally whispered, "I could learn how to breathe again here." They drove a mile further down the coastal road and arrived at the cottage, modest, whitewashed, with a red tin roof that glinted under the late afternoon sun. The porch faced the water. Inside, the house smelled faintly of cedar and seaweed. The furniture was old but clean, mismatched in a way that felt lived in rather than forgotten. Evelyn ran her hand along the back of a faded armchair, then sat down with a long sigh. "This is good," she said. "It's not mine, and that's why it's good." Walter smiled and stepped into the small kitchen to make tea. They didn't talk much that first evening. She watched the light change across the water, the sun melting into the horizon. And when the darkness came, it was gentle, not like the dense silence of the house she'd left behind, but soft, like a blanket pulled up to your chin. She slept without dreams. In the morning, she wrote. She pulled out the same leather-bound notebook she had once tucked between old medical records and utility bills, and began to write the story of her life. Not the cleaned-up version she used to tell Melissa when asked about family history, but the real one, the one filled with grief and fury, with sacrifice and silence. She wrote in long stretches, sometimes 3 or 4 hours at a time, sitting by the kitchen window with a cup of weak tea and the sound of gulls outside. Walter helped her find the local library. It was small, tucked between a surf shop and a diner with cracked tile floors and books that still carried the scent of musty bindings and decades of hands. The librarian, a sprightly woman named Ruth, had gray hair dyed purple at the tips and a laugh that could shatter quiet like stained glass. Evelyn introduced herself modestly. "I used to run a library," she said. Ruth grinned. "We don't run this place so much as hang on to it by the spine." They needed volunteers. Evelyn started shelving books. Then she started reading to the children on Saturday mornings. And then one Tuesday afternoon, when the usual guest canceled last minute, Ruth asked if Evelyn could fill in for the senior storytelling circle. She almost said no, but something in her, something quiet and pulsing, said yes. She sat in the center of the small circle of folding chairs, cleared her throat, and began not with fiction but with truth. She told them a piece of her story. Not everything, just enough. A woman in the front row. Her name was Gloria. Early 80s. Thick glasses and fingers that fidgeted with her scarf burst into tears halfway through. "Sorry," she said, wiping her cheeks. "It's just, my grandson forged my checks. Took everything. I didn't think anyone else." Evelyn walked over and touched her hand. "You're not the only one," she said gently. "You're just the one who's still standing." After that, they asked her to come every week. Word spread. People came in from the edges of the town. Quiet women with silver hair and polite smiles that masked long histories, men who once ran businesses, but now sat in modest apartments with nothing but quiet rage and stories no one asked to hear. Evelyn listened. She nodded. And sometimes when they couldn't say it themselves, she told her own story bit by bit, like a map made out of scars. Walter watched from the sidelines, never speaking, always present. He drove her to and from the library, brought her sandwiches wrapped in wax paper, repaired the shelves when no one else could. At night they sat on the porch watching the stars appear one by one. One evening Evelyn looked at him and said, "You think I'm too old to matter." He turned to her slowly. "I think you're just old enough to be dangerous." She laughed then deep, and from the chest the first real laugh she'd let out in years. The cottage changed. Plants grew in the window boxes. A wind chime hung near the back door. The dining table filled with handwritten pages, Ruth's editorial notes, lists of names Evelyn wanted to remember. She started writing letters. To women she'd met, to Melissa but not to send, to herself at different ages, to Jonah. She wrote until her fingers cramped and her eyes watered, but she didn't stop. She wrote until her story stopped feeling like a wound and started feeling like a song. On the first anniversary of her arrival, the library hosted a small celebration. They called it the Quiet Revolution. They read her essays out loud. Gloria baked a terrible carrot cake that everyone pretended to love. And when Evelyn stood at the front of the room to speak, she didn't use notes. She said, "I was taught that being silent made you strong, that bearing pain without complaint made you noble. I lived like that for a long time. But silence isn't strength. Silence is what people rely on when they don't want to be held accountable. If you've ever felt small in a house you paid for, if you've ever handed over love like a blank check, if you've ever been told you're too old, too weak, too soft to matter, this is your reminder. Your story is not over. You are not disposable. You are not finished. And you are never too late to begin again." The room stood still for a moment, and then the applause came like a wave. Evelyn smiled and sat down, her heart full, her hands steady. Outside the ocean rolled on, and the sun shone through the windows like something holy. The library smelled of old paper, pine wood polish, and warm sun filtered through tall, arched windows. Melissa Carter stood just inside the doorway, clutching the straps of her designer handbag, her heels silent against the worn tile floor. She hadn't planned to come. She had told herself it was curiosity, a harmless detour on the way back from a business meeting in town. But when her car passed the white-painted sign for the Pinebrook Community Library, something in her chest twisted tight and undeniable. Now she stood frozen, caught between pride and regret, eyes fixed on the display wall near the reading nook. There, encased in glass and framed in soft cherry wood, hung a photo she hadn't seen in years. Evelyn. In it, her grandmother was seated at a table surrounded by children, holding a weathered copy of Anne of Green Gables. Her hair, more silver than white now, was swept into a loose bun. Her smile was effortless, real in a way Melissa couldn't remember. Below the frame, a small plaque read, Evelyn Carter, Founding Patron, Carter Literacy Trust, for those who were never heard. Melissa's lips parted. She took a step forward, the world blurring at the edges. Her throat tightened, as if trying to hold back years she hadn't known she carried. Her hand lifted slightly, not to touch the frame, but to anchor herself. The memories came uninvited. Afternoons at the library when she was a girl, Evelyn helping her trace letters with a crayon clutched in a chubby hand. Sunday mornings over blueberry pancakes. Late-night whispers when storms rattled the windows, and Evelyn's voice was the only thing steady. She had thrown it all away. For what? For money, for control, for a house that no longer wanted her. She turned her face away, a single tear sliding down her cheek, catching on her jawline. She wiped it roughly with the back of her hand and moved toward the door. No one stopped her. No one recognized her. That was the worst part. She wasn't Evelyn Carter's legacy. She was her footnote. Up the coast, just before dusk, Evelyn sat on the porch of the little seaside cottage. The sky was painted in bands of coral and lavender, the clouds stretched thin like whispers. The ocean sang in long, slow sighs, its breath steady against the sand below. She wore a cardigan Walter had given her last Christmas, a faded green thing with wooden buttons warm and forgiving. A crocheted blanket covered her legs. Her fingers, now more weathered than ever, wrapped around the worn spine of a journal. She hadn't written today. Some days didn't need words. The screen door creaked open behind her. Walter stepped onto the porch, carrying 2 mismatched mugs of tea, the steam rising between them in twin curls. He handed her one without a word, and sat in the chair beside her, his joints groaning in protest. They sat that way for a while, just breathing. The quiet between them was no longer heavy. It was alive, full of the things they no longer had to say aloud. Walter finally broke the silence, his voice low. "Did I ever tell you how the ocean always scared me a little?" Evelyn smiled faintly. "You, the man who used to cross-examine criminal embezzlers in open court." He chuckled. "It's not the waves that scare me. It's how little they care. No matter what happens on land, they just keep going." Evelyn looked out at the water, the vast expanse of unknowable blue, and nodded slowly. "That's not fear, Walter," she said quietly. "That's reverence." He took a sip of his tea. "How are you feeling?" She didn't answer right away. She leaned back, the rocking chair shifting beneath her gently. Her eyes scanned the horizon. "I used to think freedom meant winning," she said. "Proving someone wrong, getting justice, standing at the finish line with my arms raised." "And now?" he asked. She exhaled. "Now I know you don't have to win anything. You just have to not lose yourself." Walter turned to her, nodding slightly. "No one ever taught us that part," he said. "They just told us to endure." She looked over at him, the corners of her eyes wrinkling into a quiet smile. "I endured," she said, "and then I left." He clinked his mug gently against hers. "To leaving," he offered. "To not going back," she answered. They drank in silence. Below them the waves danced with the golden fringe of sunset. Gulls circled lazily overhead, their cries distant and softened by the breeze. Evelyn closed her eyes, the salt air filling her lungs. Her heart was no longer heavy. Her story no longer a burden to carry, but a gift to pass on. In the distance, the lighthouse began to blink steady, reliable a signal to anyone still lost at sea. The camera pulled back, from the porch to the house to the garden where lavender bloomed wild and untrimmed. Back further to the shoreline where the water kissed the rocks without demand. The sound of the waves continued rising and falling like breath, and in the fading light, Evelyn Carter, once forgotten, once betrayed, once nearly erased, sat still at peace, unmoved by the past and unafraid of what came next. Not a victor, not a victim, simply free.